Good morning, students. This is I would call it the famous, some students would call it the infamous Cheeseburger Lecture. And there's a reason we call it a Cheeseburger Lecture, but it essentially is my way of helping you to remember and taking you through the 1600s in England. And this time period in England is a movement from absolutism to a new system of government in England called constitutionalism. And so hopefully it's going to help you to kind of understand absolutism in general, but also to understand how England was able to move away from it into constitutionalism starting in 1688. And then you're going to see that it'll take over 100 years for places like France to set up a constitutional system, and then it won't work. And then places like the United States, which is a colony of England, which in the late 1700s will have a revolution and set up a even more constitutional system. So the image you see here is of the beheading of King Charles I, and he was the king prior to the English Civil War. So just so you understand, absolutism, moving away from it and going to constitutionalism is usually not an easy process. And a lot of times it takes the beheading of kings, it takes violence in order to move, at least what we've seen, in order to move in history from a system where one person has complete authority based on a divine right of kings to a system where the people are in charge is not an easy move. So you guys, the cheeseburger is a memory device. It's a way for you to remember the 1600s in England, starting with the buns, the top bun, and then moving down to the bottom. And yes, it's not the way you build a burger, but it's the way we read from top to bottom. So it's just the way it's gonna go. Yes, I understand you start at the bottom and build your burger up, but I'm not gonna mess with that. So top of our bun, first bun, James I. Then it goes to Charles I. We call it a cheeseburger because he's the cheese, Charles Cheese. And then just so you know, I put some ketchup right there because he's gonna bleed. He's gonna die. He's gonna get killed. His head's gonna get cut off. And then comes the Cromwell Puritan patty. That's right, Puritan patty. It's plain and not very tasty without all of the other, what do we call those things? We call them condiments. That's right. All right, so you're going to have the Cromwell Puritan patty in the middle, and then people are not going to like that in England, so they're going to say, we need some more cheese. So you're going to bring Charles II back, and it's going to be called the Restoration Monarchy. And then Charles II is going to die naturally, so no blood necessary. And then you're going to bring on his brother, James II. And your cheeseburger, as we go through these slides, is going to develop, and you're going to see what all goes into these different parts, the ingredients of the bun. But just to understand, this is the process by which the English have to go through, all of these leaders, in order for them to come out on the other end with an actual glorious revolution, is what we call it, where the English finally get what's called a constitutional monarchy. So we're going to go through many absolutists, and then we're going to have this guy in the middle who I would say he doesn't call himself king, but he might as well be a king, named Cromwell. And so we'll go through all of these people. They'll have a civil war, and eventually the English will figure out how to put the parliament in charge of the king and have a glorious revolution. All right, James I is an absolutist, and he becomes king in a kind of interesting process. Because Elizabeth I was considered the Virgin Queen and had no children, they are going to need to look for the next person in line for the throne. And that person is James I. He is currently the King of Scotland because his mother was Mary, Queen of Scots. Yes, that's right, the woman that Elizabeth had killed because she was plotting against her with Catholics to take over England. So he will become King of England and of Scotland. He had originally been called James VI of Scotland, but he will be named James I of England. And he will be King of Scotland starting in 1603. Because James I believes himself to be a divine right king, he doesn't think that he has to talk to Parliament about any of the decisions he's making. And so he does some things that make people upset, but at this point, not upset enough to start a civil war. So he levied, that means raised, new taxes on the people. He also was against Puritans, who were extreme Protestants at the time, and he was also against Catholics. And as a result, he had two groups of people that were upset with him: the Catholics, who didn't like the Protestant rule, and the Puritans, who didn't like the current Protestant rule of the Anglican Church. Catholics are so unhappy with him that they plot to assassinate James I and to blow up Parliament on November 5th, 1605. And this is actually celebrated every year in England and sometimes in New England in the United States by people. You're supposed to always remember the 5th of November as a time when the plot was thwarted, and actually Catholics were not able to blow up Parliament. They were arrested, and then they were put on trial, and then many of the plotters were executed. It's called the Gunpowder Plot, and it was a result of, again, the Catholics wanting more power and feeling like they were being mistreated in England. I have a little video segment if you ever get a chance to watch, if you're old enough. I think it might be a rated R, but this section is not, called V for Vendetta. There is a section that mentions the gunpowder plot. Let me say, Guy Fawkes was a real person. His name was Guido Fawkes, but he has become almost a mythical figure. And now they like to, when they celebrate this event, they will throw his body on a fire every year. They essentially make an effigy of him, and then they burn him. And so it's kind of how they celebrate the ending of the gunpowder plot. So I'll let you see this little video segment, and then we'll go from there.
It is to Madame Justice that I dedicate this concerto in honor of the holiday she seems to have taken from these parts, and in recognition of the impostor that stands in her stead. Tell me, do you know what day it is, Evie?
November the 4th.
Not anymore. Remember, the 5th of November, the gunpowder, treason, and plot. I know of no reason why the gunpowder treason should ever be forgot. First, the overture. Yes, the strings. Listen carefully, can you hear it? Now the brass.
I can hear it. Look outside, Mummy. They're playing music. How did you do that?
Wait! Here comes the crescendo! How beautiful is it not?
So after the Guy Fawkes plot, or the gunpowder plot, was thwarted on November 5th, 1605, there were other issues that made James I's rule difficult. And that one of them was that in his court was a duke by the name of the Duke of Buckingham, who he was rumored to have a homosexual relationship with. And so there were some questions about his leadership and that kind of activity. So there was a lot of stuff going on. Raising taxes makes you not liked. Being in the middle or a moderate between two different religious groups makes you not liked. So, and then also having some social issues going on within your court makes you not liked. So James I had a lot of people out for him, but he was able, because of strong leadership and because people somewhat respected him in other areas, they kind of allowed him to continue to rule. A couple other things that came up that made people frustrated with James I, but again, not enough to do anything yet, was that James I made peace with Spain, and Spain has been an enemy of the British, mostly in their competition for colonies in the New World, and also the fact that Spain was Catholic and had been on the outs since the Spanish Armada of 1588 with the British, and for then James to make peace with them makes people think that he is too soft on the Spanish and might actually be too nice to Catholics. So again, when the Catholics are plotting to kill you, he did try to relax and lessen some of the laws that were against the Catholics, but it was too much and it was too late. So too much for the Protestants who didn't want any laws relaxed, and too late for the Catholics who had already kind of given up on James I taking care of them. He also is going to be hesitant to get involved in the 30 Years' War. Most people thought that England, being a Protestant nation, should come in and help the German Protestants in the 30 Years' War, who were being attacked from Spain and the Holy Roman Empire. And so they were struggling, and England was unwilling to commit. And Henry IV, who was the Henry IV that we talk about as a politique similar to Elizabeth I, he had called James I the wisest fool in Christendom, essentially understanding that James I was wise in trying to take that moderate position between the more extreme Protestants and the Catholics in his country, but sometimes going in the middle doesn't actually make for good policy. So again, Henry IV, as a person who switched faiths for his people, he found that James I was the wisest fool. Henry IV also was assassinated, so I don't necessarily think I'd take everything he says for how you should actually pursue things. So Charles I is going to be our first slice of cheese, and he is the son of James I. Charles I would reign from 1625 until 1649. He's actually going to marry the French king's sister, Henrietta Maria, and we know the French during this time period are going to be Catholic. And so by Charles I marrying a Catholic, for the Protestants and even the extreme Protestants, the Puritans in England, this is going to be an indication that Charles I is not going to be someone they want to have as their king. So there are some good things that he does, at least from the perspective of England and their leadership, is he is able to bring Ireland under the control of England during this time period. He's going to set up for England the East India Company and start to set up trading posts in India, so expanding the economic power of England. He also is going to be responsible for encouraging and setting up some of the English settlements in the New World. Now, some of it was solving a problem of his, which is that the Puritans were very unhappy with him. And so in 1620, the Puritans are going to end up in New England, in Plymouth. But the good things are not good enough. The bad stuff. In order to fund a new war with Spain and France, Charles is going to have to raise taxes and tariffs and duties. He is in debt because he is going to start to get involved in the 30 Years' War, and so he's going to need money to pay for that. So all of his adventures he needs money for, and the result of that is that he is going to need to call Parliament, and he calls Parliament on two separate occasions. On the first occasion, he calls them and he's angry with what they decide, and he decides that I don't need you, Parliament, and they call it the short Parliament because he tells them to go away, and then he rules for over a decade without calling Parliament again during that time period. So he dissolves Parliament from 1628 to 1640. He doesn't call them, he doesn't contact them, and he pretty much does everything without Parliament's consent. Because when he called Parliament, they said, no, you're going to need to sign a petition of right if we're going to allow you to do these things. And that petition was said that he couldn't raise taxes without Parliament's consent. Well, Charles signs it, but then immediately decides not to follow that, and that's why it's called the short Parliament. He gets what he wants, he signs the document, he goes ahead, dissolves Parliament, and then rules from 1628 to 1640 without calling Parliament until it's too late. So he will call Parliament again. It will be called the Long Parliament, because once he calls Parliament again, they know that if they don't get in control of their king, that they are never going to get called again. And so at this point, you're going to have a parliamentary army that develops, and you're going to have England's civil war, which will result in the execution of Charles I. And as a result, we are going to put ketchup on our cheeseburger because it's getting bloody.
Charles I of England and Scotland has recalled Parliament. Why? Because his Scottish subjects were rebelling against his religious reforms and he needed men and money to fight them. He was hoping that Parliament would forget the previous 11 years in which he had governed without them and simply give him the money. He was wrong. Instead, Parliament wanted to right all of Charles's previous wrongs against them, and so he dissolved it after only 3 weeks, hence its name, the Short Parliament. The rebelling Scots, called Covenanters, soon after crossed the English border and occupied these lands. Thomas Wentworth, the king's close ally, was to lead the English resistance, but instead the army opted for a different strategy of running away. Charles then decided to cave in to most of the Scots' demands, and also he would pay them to leave the parts of the north that they'd seized. Charles needed yet more money to pay them, and so once more he had to recall Parliament. He did so, hoping that yet again they'd simply give him the money, but instead Parliament passed some acts that Charles did not like, but given his weak position could do nothing about. Opposition to Charles was led by a man called John Pym, a fierce Puritan and believer in the rights of Parliament. Parliament had passed the Triennial Act, which meant that Parliament had to be called at least once every 3 years, and that this specific Parliament had to give its consent to be dissolved. There was also the Habeas Corpus Act, which meant that the king couldn't arrest whomever he pleased anymore. Furthermore, William Laud, the Archbishop of Canterbury, was arrested, and Parliament also had Thomas Wentworth executed for his previous conduct in Ireland. Seeing that Charles was making concessions to the English and Scottish, many Irishmen were hoping for the same. Some Irish nobles, led by Philip O'Neill, seized forts and demanded that the Irish be afforded similar concessions. The Irish populace rose up shortly afterwards, but they were less interested in concessions and more interested in kicking the planted English Protestants out of Ireland for good. Back in England, Parliament was still fighting over how much King Charles was awful, and in late 1641, by a very slim margin, it passed the Grand Remonstrance. This was basically a list of reasons why Charles was terrible, and that the previous church reforms of Laud in the Irish Rebellion were part of a Catholic plot. By 1642, Charles had had enough of people opposing him and decided to put an end to it. He gathered some soldiers and marched into Parliament with the intent of arresting 5 of its members, the most notable being John Pym. These members had fled before Charles had arrived, and he left Parliament empty-handed. Whilst he failed to arrest those who'd opposed him, he did manage to do one thing. He convinced everyone that he was a tyrant. As a result, Parliament created the Committee of Safety, which promptly took control of London as well as its militia, and Charles quickly fled the city. Both sides started to court allies and made preparations for conflict, such as when Charles attempted to seize Hull and its armoury, but they politely yet firmly told him to jog on. Parliament declared that Charles was a papist and wanted to enslave England with the help of the Irish rebels, and Charles warned the aristocracy that Parliament would come for them next if the radicals had their way. On the 22nd of August 1642, Charles raised his standard over the town of Nottingham. This is considered by many to be the formal beginning of the English Civil War. This pitted Charles's royalist forces, known as Cavaliers, against those of Parliament, known as the Roundheads. As a general rule, Parliament had the support of the South and the East, and Charles had the rest. Parliament had much greater access to money from the larger cities in the South. It also controlled the navy, and with it, trade. The king had some support in Ireland, the help of the Scottish royalists, and had access to much better commanders, the most notable being Prince Rupert of the Rhine, Charles's nephew from Bohemia. Charles assembled his forces and made straight for London, where he was met by the parliamentary army led by Robert Devereux, the Earl of Essex, at the Battle of Edgehill. It was essentially a tie, and after regrouping, Charles dithered on what to do next before resuming his march on London. By this point, the Earl of Essex had blocked the road there, and Charles retreated, meaning that this wasn't going to be a short war. Throughout 1643, the royalist forces gained the upper hand. The parliamentarians did manage to procure the help of the Scottish Covenanter army, though, by promising them lots of cash. The Scottish also wanted assurances that the Church of England would be modelled after the Church of Scotland. Naturally, Parliament was never going to agree to this, and so its leaders hatched a clever plan. They lied. The Covenanters were vital to the parliamentarian cause and proved their worth in 1644 at the Battle of Marston Moor. It was here that the royalist army was devastated, particularly by the parliamentarian cavalry led by a certain Oliver Cromwell. After this defeat, the royalists basically lost the entire north, and York fell shortly afterwards. Despite their success, Parliament wanted more, and so ordered that far-reaching reforms be implemented, which led to the creation of the professional, well-equipped new model army. It's important to note here that not all of the country was happy to be involved in the Civil War. Many local lords and leaders wanted nothing to do with it, and so assembled their own soldiers, known as clubmen, to dissuade either side from coming anywhere near them. 1645 saw the decisive Battle of Naseby, which was yet again a crushing defeat for the royalists, and was followed up by many more over the next year. Charles, knowing that the war was lost, handed himself over to a Scottish force in mid-1646, ending the Civil War. Parliament negotiated with the Scottish to hand over Charles, which they did in 1647. Now that Parliament had Charles, surely they could enact the change they wanted, right? But no. The issue was that Charles was completely untrustworthy and would always take the first opportunity to undo the concessions he'd made. Furthermore, much of England was getting riotous due to the tax burden for funding the army. Parliament tried to disband the army, but the army, led by Sir Thomas Fairfax, said no, which was hard to argue with because guns. This reflects the fact that political society in England was becoming increasingly radical during this period. One of the most extreme groups were the Levellers, who wanted the army to throw out Parliament and create a democratic, i.e. level, society in which all freeborn men would be able to vote for accountable politicians. During his captivity, Charles had secretly made a compact with the Scottish called the Engagement, which meant that they would invade England and restore him with his old powers intact. Charles soon escaped, the Scottish invaded, and royalist rebellions broke out across the country, beginning the Second English Civil War. This war was a short one, and within a year the new model army had crushed the rebels and defeated the Scottish army at the Battle of Preston. Charles decided to return to the negotiating table, but the leadership of the new model army, known as the Grandees, weren't interested. They saw Charles as a lying tyrant whose actions had killed thousands needlessly, and that there would be no worthwhile settlement whilst he remained. In late 1648, some soldiers, commanded by Colonel Thomas Pride, stormed Parliament and removed anyone who disagreed with the Grandees in what is known as Pride's Purge. The Parliament that was left, known as the Rump Parliament, opted to put Charles on trial for high treason. He was found guilty, sentenced to death, and on the 30th of January 1649 was beheaded at Whitehall Palace. Shortly afterwards, a republic was declared called the Commonwealth of England, which was governed by the Rump Parliament and the Council of State, chaired by Cromwell. Parliament and the Council didn't really do much except sell off royal assets and lands in order to fund the army to send it to Ireland. The Irish rebels, known as the Irish Confederates, were being supported by English and Scottish royalists who had rallied behind Charles's son, also called Charles. Cromwell was tasked with the reconquest of Ireland and with his army of well-equipped veterans made inroads very quickly. He gave the Irish assurances that those who surrendered would not be harmed, but when he took the towns of Drogheda and Wexford, he promptly slaughtered their garrisons and many of the civilians living there. Cromwell returned to England in 1650, but the conquest was largely completed in his absence by 1652. Ireland was completely ransacked during this invasion, and it's estimated that about 40% of its total population died between 1641 and 1652. It was then ordered that the rebels were to lose their lands, and about 35,000 of them were forced into indentured servitude and shipped off to the New World to work on the plantations there. Speaking of the New World, most of the American colonies backed the royalist side, but with greater support for Cromwell in the north. So upon his return to England, Cromwell had to deal with the Scottish, who had received Charles and proclaimed him as Charles II of Scotland, beginning the Third English Civil War. Cromwell marched his army north and crushed a larger force at the Battle of Dunbar and swiftly occupied Edinburgh. The next year the two met again at Worcester, and yet again Charles lost and promptly ran away to the continent, ending once and for all the English Civil Wars. By 1653, Cromwell was getting a bit sick of the Rump Parliament and so dismissed most of its members. He then created a parliament made up of a select few men who were considered to be deeply moral in what is known as the Parliament of the Saints or the Barebones Parliament. This parliament failed to do anything, and so Cromwell had a constitution crafted called the Instrument of Government, which declared Cromwell to be the Lord Protector of the Commonwealth of England, Scotland and Ireland. That is to say that all three were now part of the same state, meaning Cromwell, with the help of the Scottish General George Monk, had achieved what all the previous kings of England had failed to. Anyway, Cromwell's rule was marred with financial problems, and it also saw the Commonwealth dragged into numerous wars. The first was the First Anglo-Dutch War in 1652, which started because of the 1651 Navigation Act, which prevented English colonies in North America from trading with foreign states. Long story short, the Dutch lost, but very little changed. This wasn't to be Cromwell's last foreign war, since in 1654 one broke out with Spain. In the end, the Commonwealth seized Jamaica and the Cayman Islands in the Caribbean, as well as Dunkirk in Europe. Back in England, Cromwell was struggling with his new regime. In 1657, after a failed period of direct military rule, a new constitution was passed and Cromwell was offered the crown, which he declined. Resistance to his rule was starting to grow, and so he had to resort to much fiercer tactics to get what he wanted. This included taxing without the consent of Parliament and throwing those who disagreed with him in prison without trial. Of course, he could do nothing about those who disagreed with him outside of England, such as Thomas Hobbes, who, whilst living in France, wrote his magnum opus, Leviathan. This was a defence of absolute monarchy like that in France and condemned the concept of a republic. Cromwell's troubles came to an end in 1658. Because he died. The title of Lord Protector passed to his son, Richard Cromwell, because again it was nothing like a monarchy. Basically no one wanted Richard to rule, and in 1659 he resigned and the Rump Parliament returned to run the country. This all went to hell pretty quickly and it looked like another civil war was brewing, so General Monk marched down south. Once in London, he reinstated all of the members of Parliament who had been ousted in Pride's Purge. In 1660, Parliament, the same one that had been in session since 1642, dissolved itself, hence why it is known as the Long Parliament. During this time, Monk had been in contact with Charles, who issued what was called the Declaration of Breda, forgiving everything that had happened since 1649 so long as the people there accepted him as their king. The exception to this forgiveness was of course those who signed his father's death warrant. A new parliament was summoned called the Convention Parliament, which acknowledged Charles as Charles II of England and their rightful king. In May of 1660, Charles returned, ending the Commonwealth and England's Republican experiment.
So this is a popular image that's often shown on AP tests, or you'll see in different situations, but this shows the Roundheads on the right-hand side. Notice their dog has the nice short haircut versus the Cavaliers on the left-hand side, which has the long flowing locks, representing the Roundheads representing the Parliament and the Puritans and those fighting in the Civil War against King Charles I, and the Cavaliers on the left-hand side. You can kind of remember them just because long-haired, like those flowing locks, are often related to nobles and people who have money, that they can have those wigs and that kind of thing on. So the Cavaliers are on the left-hand side, and they supported Charles I. Sometimes they're also called the Royalists, again supporting the royalty. So the video you watched talked quite a bit about Oliver Cromwell, or our Puritan Paddy. He's the one who leads the parliamentary army in the Civil War against Charles I. When the Parliament wins, Charles I is executed and the monarchy is abolished, as well as the House of Lords and the Anglican Church. There is a time period where the army, the new model army, will debate what type of government they want to have. And so sometimes you'll see documents called the New Model Army Debates. And they essentially debated between whether or not they wanted some kind of monarchy or some kind of democracy. And in the end, they ended up with a Lord Protectorate, which is what Cromwell called himself, but more on the side of a military dictatorship. They conquered Catholic countries and also took over Scotland and Ireland. They also, because they were Puritans, they wanted to purify the Anglican Church, and so they prohibited drinking and theater going and dancing. So that is your Puritan Paddy. And you saw it in that video. After all of the war, 20 years really of war consistently from 1640 to 1660, England is ready for some calm. And so when Cromwell dies, they're going to want to bring back the monarchy and restore the Stuarts to the throne. So they're going to call back Charles II, who had attempted a couple of times to be the leader of England with the help of Scotland, but they're going to call him back. He had been hanging out with Louis XIV in France. You can see from the painting on your right-hand side that it looks like he took some cues on how to dress and how to get your picture taken. Again, painting, because those legs are looking pretty fine. So notice this is our second piece of cheese, Charles II. So he is our next piece of cheese. He's going to come back to England, and he is going to restore the monarchy. He had made some secret deal with Louis XIV that if he was helped to go back, that he would make England Catholic again. He will not follow through with that, but his younger brother will. What he will do for the Catholics is increase the religious toleration. So while he was in France hanging out with Louis XIV, he had planned to convert to Catholicism, but he knew that he needed to be careful with that. So he actually won't convert until he's on his deathbed, and he'll be like, yeah, I was Catholic the whole time. And people are thinking, yeah, we thought you were. But Charles II didn't officially convert until he was on his deathbed. But he did increase religious toleration, and a lot of times the Parliament fought him on it and kind of went against him back and forth. He came up with the Declaration of Indulgence that suspended all the laws against Catholics and non-Anglican Protestants, so that was a smart move because then you're letting the Puritans off too. Parliament's going to force Charles to rescind that declaration, and they're going to pass the Test Act, which required that all people in the military and in the government had to swear an oath against the doctrine of transubstantiation, which we talked about is a Catholic doctrine that believes in the changing of the elements during the sacrament of communion into the body and blood of Christ. So if you believe that, you would not be able to swear this oath, which means essentially Catholics were barred from civic and military service. Then there's something called the Popish Plot under Charles II, where where essentially they try to get rid of Charles II and bring his younger brother in, James II, who has already converted to Catholicism and is an open Catholic practicing Catholicism, and they want to put him on the throne. But what you're going to find out is that the Whigs in Parliament, who are supportive of Charles II, are going to have Catholics executed in response to this plot. Most of the Catholics end up being innocent. So then Charles responds by having Whig members executed because they had just executed Catholics. And then on his deathbed, he converts to Catholicism. And obviously then James II is going to come to power, and he is a practicing Catholic. And so now the Catholics are very excited. So here comes James II, our fully Catholic king. He had converted to Catholicism, hanging out with Louis XIV. He and his brother, when their father was executed, fled to France and hung out at the Palace of Versailles with Louis XIV. And so what he's going to do is he's immediately going to come in and repeal that Test Act that was making it so that Catholics couldn't be in the military and could not also be in government offices. He's going to put Catholics in positions of power. He's going to bring back the Declaration of Indulgence, permitting religious freedom. And the worst thing for the Protestants and Puritans in England is that he gets remarried. He had had 2 older daughters with his first wife, who was a Protestant. But then when he goes to France, he falls in love. The first wife had died. He marries a new lady who is much younger, because most people were thinking this guy's too old. But he's never too old to have a kid. And so he has a son by his second wife, who is also a Catholic. And so this becomes a really big issue, because now you have the son always goes first. So even though the daughters are older, they're not going to inherit the throne. And so now you're going to have a legacy of Catholics on the throne in England. And that is not going to be okay for the English people and for Parliament, who have since Henry VIII been moving away from the Catholic Church, with moments where they get pulled back. But for the most part, people are either Anglican Protestants or in this area are Calvinists. And so they do not want to be Catholic, which is the religion of a minority group of people in England. So this son makes it so that they anticipate that they are going to be under Catholic rule for a very long time. And so the next step is for the Parliament to get a hold of James II's oldest daughter, who is married to William III of Orange in the Netherlands, and they're ruling there. Her name is Mary, and they are going to get a hold of them and say, hey, if you come and take over our country, we will support you. And so that is where we start to get the Glorious Revolution, in that James II decides not to fight back, but to flee, because he had seen his father be executed. So he's going to flee to France and live out his life there for a long time. You're going to have people trying to restore him to the throne, and then to try to restore his son to the throne. But this family will never come back to the throne in England. The Glorious Revolution then is as follows. So the Glorious Revolution is essentially where Parliament, afraid that James II and his young son will now inherit the throne and leave Catholicism in charge in England for a considerable amount of time, they again contact William and Mary, Mary being the eldest Protestant daughter of James II, and say, come to England and we will help you to take over and be the next person to inherit the throne. James sees the writing on the wall and at this point flees. That's why I put legs with him running away. So he's going to run away to France, and you're going to have William and Mary come to power in a bloodless revolution. So that's usually why it's called glorious, is because it was bloodless. And then you're going to have a new line of people that are going to be in charge after we go through the 2 daughters. So we'll have William and Mary. They will not have a child to inherit the throne. So then the next person in line will be Mary's sister Anne, Queen Anne. So she'll rule from 1702 to 1714. And then because of this situation, Queen Anne has no children who live. And I'm going to show you that she actually had 17 pregnancies, and not one of them made it past age 11. And most of them, either they were miscarriages, or if they were born, they died before the age of 2. So she had it pretty rough. But she had no heirs, and so it'll change to a new family line, but the Act of Settlement in 1701 requires that the King of England be Protestant. Here's an image of the Wikipedia page about Queen Anne, because I just wanted to give you an idea about the experience she had and how difficult childbirth oftentimes was for certain women, and specifically with the medicine of the time period. But you can see that starting in 1684, she's going to have a stillborn daughter. Then Mary is born, but Mary dies before the age of 2. Then you have Anne Sophia, who is christened Lady Anne, but also dies before her 2nd birthday. Then she has another miscarriage. Then she has a stillborn son, another miscarriage. And this is the one that lives the longest, which is Prince William. He died of unclear causes at the age of 11. Then she's going to have another daughter named Mary, who was born 2 months premature and lived a couple hours. Then she's going to have George. He lives only a few minutes. And then she's going to have a stillborn daughter, and another miscarriage, and another miscarriage, and another miscarriage, and another one, and another one. And then a stillborn son, and then another stillborn son. So again, it wasn't for lack of trying that she didn't have an heir. So just to wrap this up, this cheeseburger, again, is this movement from England, from an absolutist James I, all the way down to where we finally get to a glorious revolution with William and Mary coming in, and they sign the English Bill of Rights. One of the things the Parliament required before they could become co-regents or king and queen of England is they had to sign this Bill of Rights, which made it so that a lot of the things that the Parliament was concerned about before were taken care of. So people had, the Parliament was always had to meet. The Parliament was going to essentially put the king and queen on an allowance that was never enough for them to be able to rule without talking to Parliament continually and asking for money. So it's essentially like they've made the monarchs like children in your house that have to come asking for anything that they want to do. They need to get their allowance in order to live, and they need to listen to the Parliament and defer to the Parliament. And so you're going to see the Parliament after this has a lot more power. Now again, we're not talking about democracy. We're talking about a monarch that is controlled by a constitution, and a Parliament that has more power. But again, this Parliament is controlled by nobility. So the average person isn't represented in Parliament. These are the nobles that have interests, that have land, and they are going to work along with the king and queen, and with a written constitution that makes it so that nobles don't get thrown in prison, people don't get executed without some kind of due process.